They expected you to leave, not eventually, inevitably. That expectation wasn't built from one experience. It was conditioned over time, reinforced by every moment where vulnerability led to disappointment, where closeness turned into pressure, or where love came with conditions they couldn't meet. So when you entered their life, they didn't see you as an exception. They saw you as a matter of time. And this is where the dynamic becomes psychologically complex, because your consistency didn't just comfort them, it disrupted them. When someone is used to instability, stability doesn't immediately feel safe. It feels unfamiliar. And the human mind, especially one shaped by avoidance, interprets unfamiliarity as risk. So every time you stayed calm when they pulled back, every time you responded with understanding instead of reaction, you created a kind of cognitive dissonance inside them. Their internal model said, this is where the person leaves. But you didn't. And that gap between expectation and reality forced them into a space they didn't know how to navigate. Now, from the outside, it can look simple. You loved them, you stayed. But from their internal experience, it wasn't simple at all. It was destabilizing. Because your presence wasn't just presence, it was evidence. Evidence that contradicted a belief system they had relied on for emotional survival. Avoidants don't avoid love because they don't want it. They avoid it because they don't trust its permanence. So when you remain consistent, you weren't just offering love, you were challenging their sense of certainty. And certainty, even if it's painful, feels safer than the unknown. That's why your patience didn't always create closeness. Sometimes it created distance. Because the more you proved you weren't leaving, the more they had to confront the possibility that they might be wrong about themselves. And that's not a small shift. That's an identity level disruption. Think about it this way. If someone has spent years believing they are too difficult to love, too complex to be understood, or too flawed to be chosen long-term, then your consistency doesn't just feel kind, it feels suspicious. Not because of who you are, but because of what it implies. It implies that their narrative might not be true. And people don't let go of their narratives easily, even painful ones, especially painful ones, because those narratives create predictability. They allow the person to stay emotionally prepared, even if it means staying disconnected. So when you stayed, you didn't just offer them love, you placed them in a position where they had to either expand their capacity to receive it or retreat back into what felt familiar. And more often than not, they chose familiarity. But here's the part that often gets overlooked. Your staying was not invisible to them. They noticed, even in silence, even in distance, even when they couldn't respond the way you hoped they noticed. Your consistency registered on a level deeper than their behavior could express. And over time, that creates something powerful. Because even if they couldn't meet you where you were, they were being exposed to a new standard of connection. A standard that doesn't disappear under pressure. A standard that doesn't collapse at the first sign of difficulty. You became a reference point. And whether they admitted it or not, that reference point stayed with them. It shaped how they began to see relationships, how they evaluated their own patterns, and eventually how they understood what they had. Because the truth is, they didn't expect you to stay, but you did. And that changes everything. Because when someone who was prepared to lose you realizes you were never trying to leave, they're forced to confront a reality they spent years avoiding. Not everyone walks away. And once that expectation is disrupted, once they see that you didn't leave when you were supposed to, something deeper begins to surface. Because your consistency doesn't just challenge their beliefs about relationships, it begins to expose their beliefs about themselves. This is where love stops being comforting and starts becoming confronting. When you truly see someone, when you listen beyond their words, when you respond to what they feel instead of just what they say, you create a level of emotional exposure that most avoidants have spent years learning to escape. Not because they lack depth, but because they have too much of it without the tools to manage it safely. Your empathy became a kind of spotlight. And under that light, everything they had pushed down, fear of rejection, fear of inadequacy, fear of being fully known, started to rise to the surface. Now, from your perspective, you were simply loving them. You were being patient, understanding, present. But from their internal experience, it felt like something entirely different. It felt like being seen without the ability to hide. And that's a powerful moment psychologically. Because for someone who has built their identity around self-protection, being seen isn't immediately experienced as connection, it's experienced as vulnerability without control. And vulnerability to an avoidant mind is not neutral. It's associated with risk. So the closer you got emotionally, the more tension they felt internally. Not because you were doing something wrong, but because you were doing something unfamiliar. You weren't asking them to perform. You weren't reacting in predictable ways. You weren't reinforcing their defensive patterns. You were simply present. And presence, when it's consistent, removes escape routes. This is why avoidants often become more distant as emotional intimacy increases. It's not a lack of feeling, it's an overload of it. They begin to feel things they don't have language for, reactions they can't regulate, and fears they can't easily rationalize away. And instead of leaning into that discomfort, their instinct is to step back from the source of it, which in this case is you. But here's the deeper layer. What they were actually stepping back from wasn't you, it was what you revealed inside them. Because your love didn't just offer connection, it created reflection. It showed them parts of themselves they had avoided confronting. It showed them their need for control, their fear of dependency, their discomfort with emotional openness, and perhaps most unsettling of all, it showed them that they were capable of being loved in a way they didn't believe was possible. And that realization carries weight, because once someone sees that they are worthy of genuine connection, even if they resist it, they can't fully return to the illusion that they are better off without it. The awareness stays quiet, persistent, and often uncomfortable. So when they pulled away, it wasn't because your love lacked value, it was because your love carried depth, and depth requires presence. It requires emotional engagement. It requires a willingness to sit with uncertainty and not immediately retreat from it. And for someone who has spent years mastering emotional distance, that's a significant demand. But again, none of this was lost on them. Even if they couldn't articulate it, even if they responded with silence or space, the impact remained. You introduced them to a level of emotional honesty that doesn't disappear easily. And that's why long after the moment has passed, long after the interaction ends, they're still processing what it meant. Because your love didn't just reach them, it revealed them. And when someone begins to feel that level of exposure, when the internal world starts to surface in ways they can't easily manage, the instinct isn't to move closer. The instinct is to regain control. This is the moment where their behavior can seem the most confusing. Because just as the connection begins to deepen, just as the emotional bond starts to take shape, they shift, they pull back, they become distant, less responsive, sometimes even cold. And from the outside, it can feel like a contradiction. How can someone move away from something that is clearly meaningful? But internally, it doesn't feel like they're moving away from meaning. It feels like they're moving back towards stability. You have to understand, for an avoidant, control is not about dominance, it's about safety. It's the mechanism they rely on to regulate emotional intensity. When feelings stay within a certain range, they can function, they can engage, they can even appear deeply connected. But when that intensity crosses a threshold, when vulnerability becomes unavoidable, that's when the system activates. And that system says, create space. Not because they don't care, but because caring has started to feel overwhelming. Not because the connection isn't real, but because it has become real enough to matter. And when something matters, it carries the potential for loss, for disappointment, for exposure. So rather than risk being overtaken by that uncertainty, they step back into what they can manage. Distance. Distance gives them clarity, or at least the illusion of it. It allows them to reestablish emotional boundaries, to quiet the internal noise, to return to a version of themselves that feels more composed. And in that state, they can tell themselves a story that makes sense. This is too much, or this isn't right, or I need space. But those explanations are often surface level. Underneath them is something more fundamental, the need to restore a sense of control over their own emotional experience. Because what your presence introduced was not just connection, but unpredictability. You didn't follow the patterns they were used to. You didn't withdraw when they expected you to. You didn't escalate when things became uncertain. You stayed steady. And while that steadiness is healthy, it also removes the familiar cues they rely on to navigate relationships. So when they couldn't predict the outcome, they defaulted to what they could control, their level of involvement. And this is where the push-pull dynamic begins to take shape. They move closer, they feel the depth, and then they retreat, not randomly, but rhythmically. Each step forward increases emotional exposure. Each step back restores a sense of safety. Now, it's important to recognize that this pattern is not strategic in the way it might appear. It's not a calculated attempt to manipulate or confuse. It's an adaptive response, one that was formed long before you entered the picture. A response designed to keep them within an emotional range they know how to handle. But that doesn't make it any less impactful. Because for you, the one experiencing that distance, it can feel like rejection. It can feel like inconsistency, like mixed signals, like a lack of commitment. And those interpretations are valid from your perspective. But from theirs, it's not about rejecting you, it's about regulating themselves. They are trying to stay in control of an internal experience that feels like it could spiral if left unchecked. And the paradox is this: the more meaningful the connection becomes, the stronger that instinct to regain control can be. Because now there's more at stake, more to lose, more to feel. So they pull away not to end the connection, but to survive it. And in doing so, they create the very distance they were trying to avoid. They protect themselves from vulnerability, but they also limit the possibility of deeper connection. They maintain control, but at the cost of intimacy. And over time, that pattern becomes difficult to sustain because control can reduce intensity, but it can't replace connection. Eventually, something has to give because you can manage your emotions for a while, you can create distance, you can convince yourself that space is the solution, but you cannot control the impact of a connection that has already reached you. And that's the reality they begin to face. They weren't pushing you away because you didn't matter. They were pushing you away because you did. And after all of that, the distance, the pullback, the attempt to regain control, something else begins to register in a way they didn't expect. You didn't respond the way the pattern predicted. You didn't disappear. You didn't escalate into chaos. You didn't turn their withdrawal into a final ending. You stayed. Now, that might sound simple, but psychologically, it's anything but. Because most of what they've experienced has taught them a very specific rule. When things get difficult, people leave. Not always immediately, but eventually, especially when emotional needs aren't met in clear, consistent ways. So when you remain present through confusion, through silence, through moments where connection felt one-sided, it didn't fit into any framework they understood. Your behavior didn't confirm their expectations, it disrupted them. And disruption creates tension because now they're faced with a contradiction. On one hand, their internal model says, this is unsustainable. This person will leave. On the other hand, reality is showing them the opposite. You're still there, still engaged, still choosing connection, even when it isn't being fully reciprocated. And that raises a question they're not prepared to answer. Why? Not in a superficial sense, but in a deeper, more unsettling way. Why would someone continue to invest emotionally when the return isn't consistent? Why would someone stay grounded in the face of distance? Why doesn't this follow the same pattern as everything else? Because for them, love has often been tied to conditions, spoken or unspoken. Performance, availability, emotional alignment, and when those conditions aren't met, the expectation is that the connection weakens or ends. That's the logic they understand. But you didn't operate on that logic. Your presence introduced something different, something that didn't fluctuate based on immediate behavior. And that kind of consistency isn't just unfamiliar, it's difficult to interpret because it doesn't rely on the same rules. So they begin to question it. Is it sustainable? Is it genuine? Is it temporary? Or is it something else entirely, something they don't have language for? And while those questions are forming, another layer is unfolding underneath. Because even if they don't fully understand your reasons, they can feel the impact of your choice. They can see that you're not reacting impulsively. You're not trying to force outcomes. You're simply remaining. And that creates pressure, but not the kind they're used to. Not external pressure, not demands or expectations. It's internal pressure, the kind that comes from being faced with something real and not knowing how to meet it. Because now it's no longer about whether you'll stay. You've already shown that you can. Now it becomes about whether they can rise to meet that level of consistency. And that's where the discomfort intensifies because it shifts the focus away from external variables and places it directly on their capacity, their ability to engage, to respond, to be present in a way that aligns with what you're offering. And if they're not ready for that, if they don't yet have the tools or the awareness, it creates a gap between what's being given and what they feel capable of returning. That gap can feel overwhelming. So instead of stepping into it, they often step around it. They maintain a certain distance, not because they don't recognize your effort, but because fully acknowledging it would require them to confront their own limitations. And that's not easy to do. But here's the part that matters. Your consistency didn't go unnoticed. It didn't get dismissed or forgotten. It became a reference point, something they compare against, consciously or not, as they move through other experiences. Because once someone has seen a different model of connection, one that isn't reactive or conditional in the ways they expect, it becomes harder to accept less without recognizing it. And that recognition stays with them, even if they don't act on it immediately, even if they don't express it clearly. It remains in the background, shaping how they interpret future interactions, how they evaluate emotional presence, how they begin to understand what real consistency looks like. You showed them something that didn't match their expectations, and they couldn't ignore it. Because when someone encounters a form of connection that doesn't collapse under pressure, it challenges more than their assumptions. It challenges their entire definition of love. And once that definition begins to shift, once they've been exposed to a form of connection that doesn't operate on fear or withdrawal, they're left with something they can't easily dismiss. Not just a memory of you, but an experience of themselves in relation to you. Because your presence didn't just challenge how they see relationships, it altered how they see who they are within one. You became a mirror, not in a superficial sense, but in a deeply psychological way. You reflected back to them a version of themselves that didn't align with their long-held narrative. A version that was capable of being understood, of being stayed with, of being valued without constant performance or emotional distance. And that reflection is difficult to ignore, because for someone who has internalized the idea that closeness leads to loss or that vulnerability leads to exposure without safety, your response created a contradiction. You saw them clearly, sometimes more clearly than they saw themselves, and instead of pulling away, you leaned in with steadiness. That kind of response forces a shift in perception. Now they're not just dealing with their usual patterns. They're confronted with evidence that those patterns may not be absolute, that maybe they're not inherently too much or not enough, that maybe the issue isn't their capacity to be loved, but their capacity to receive it. And that's a different kind of realization, because it moves the focus inward. It's no longer about the external world being unreliable or relationships being inherently unstable. It becomes about their own relationship with connection, their own thresholds for intimacy, their own responses to being seen. And this is where the mirror becomes uncomfortable. Because once someone recognizes that they've been participating in the very dynamic they fear, creating distance, avoiding depth, stepping back when things become real, it's difficult to maintain the same level of detachment. Awareness doesn't immediately change behavior, but it changes perception. They start to notice their own reactions in real time. The instinct to withdraw, the hesitation to respond, the internal dialogue that justifies distance. And alongside that, awareness is the memory of how you responded differently. That contrast becomes significant because now, every time they default to old patterns, there's a quiet recognition that another way exists, a way that doesn't require constant control, a way that allows for presence without immediate retreat. And even if they're not ready to choose that path, they can't fully unsee it. That's the power of being a mirror. You don't force change. You reveal possibility. But possibility can feel just as threatening as vulnerability because it introduces responsibility. If another way exists, then continuing the same patterns is no longer unconscious. It becomes a choice. And choice brings with it a level of accountability that avoidance systems are not always prepared to hold. So what do? Often, they distance themselves from the mirror, not because the reflection is inaccurate, but because it's too accurate. It shows them not just who they are, but who they could be. And the gap between those two can feel overwhelming. And yet, even in distance, the reflection doesn't disappear. It stays with them in subtle ways, in how they interpret future connections, in how they recognize emotional availability, in how they begin to question their own responses. Because once someone has been seen without being rejected, once they've experienced presence without pressure, it creates a new internal reference, one that doesn't fade easily. You didn't just show up for them, you showed them to themselves. And that kind of clarity has a lasting impact. Because even if they move on, even if they try to return to familiar patterns, there's a part of them that now knows what it felt like to be met with consistency, to be understood without being pushed, to be accepted without needing to withdraw. And that knowing becomes a quiet force. It doesn't demand immediate change, but it creates a tension between who they've been and who they now realize they could become. And over time, That tension asks a question they can't ignore forever. Will they continue to run from the reflection or finally grow into it? And eventually, whether it happens suddenly or unfolds over time, there comes a moment where the distance they created no longer protects them from the reality of what they've lost. Because once you step back, once your consistency is no longer there to stabilize the connection, the entire dynamic shifts. Up until that point, they've had something many avoidants rarely experience. Someone who stayed without forcing, who cared without controlling, who remained present without demanding immediate change. And as long as that presence exists, there's a kind of psychological buffer. They can move in and out, regulate their distance, and still feel that the connection is available. But when that presence is gone or even just reduced, that buffer disappears. And what replaces it is silence. Not just external silence, but internal clarity. Because without your steady energy balancing the dynamic, they're left alone with the full weight of their own choices. The space they once used to feel safe now becomes the space where everything echoes. This is where realization begins. Not always dramatically, not always with immediate action, but with a shift in awareness. They start to replay moments, not just the good ones, but the subtle ones, the times you didn't react, the times you stayed calm, the times you chose understanding over distance. And those moments begin to take on a different meaning, because now they're not being experienced in real time, they're being evaluated in hindsight. And hindsight removes the emotional defenses that were active in the moment. It allows them to see what was actually there, not just how it felt at the time. And what they begin to recognize is that your presence was not ordinary. It wasn't something easily replaced or casually dismissed. It was rare. And that recognition often comes with a form of regret, not always expressed outwardly, but felt internally. Because they start to understand that the very thing they were trying to manage the depth of the connection was the same thing that made it meaningful. They weren't overwhelmed by something insignificant. They were overwhelmed by something real. And in trying to control that reality, they created distance from it. Now, it's important to approach this without romanticizing it. Regret doesn't automatically lead to change. Realization doesn't guarantee action, but it does create awareness. And awareness, once it's established, doesn't disappear easily. They begin to see patterns more clearly, not just with you, but across their experiences. The tendency to pull back when things become consistent. The instinct to create space when closeness increases. The way they interpret stability as something temporary or risky. And alongside that recognition is the memory of how you responded differently. That contrast becomes difficult to ignore, because now it's not just about what they lost, it's about what they didn't fully understand while they had it. And that gap between experience and understanding is where the weight of realization sits. They may try to rationalize it. They may tell themselves it wouldn't have worked, or that the timing was off, or that they needed something different. And sometimes those explanations hold partial truth. But underneath them, there's often a quieter recognition that goes deeper than logic. They had something meaningful, and they couldn't meet it. That's not an easy thing to sit with, because it challenges not just their decisions, but their capacity at the time those decisions were made. It raises questions about readiness, about emotional availability, about the ability to sustain connection without retreating from it. And those questions don't always have immediate answers, but they stay. They surface in moments of reflection, in new connections that don't quite measure up, in situations where they begin to recognize the same patterns emerging again. And each time, the awareness becomes a little harder to avoid, because now they've experienced a different standard, not one based on intensity or inconsistency, but one grounded in presence, patience, and emotional steadiness. And once that standard exists, even as a memory, it reshapes how everything else is perceived. You don't just forget something like that. You carry it. And whether they admit it or not, whether they act on it or not, there is a part of them that understands the significance of what they had and what they let go of. Not in a dramatic sense, but in a grounded, undeniable way. Because when someone finally sees the value of a connection after it's no longer available, the realization is clear, even if the response is not. They didn't lose you because you weren't enough. They lost you because they weren't ready to receive what you gave. And when you step back and look at the entire dynamic, not just the moments of connection, but the distance, the confusion, the push and pull, you begin to see something much deeper than a simple story of love that didn't work. You see a collision between two realities. On one side, someone who learned to protect themselves by creating space, by controlling emotional exposure, by expecting loss before it happens. On the other side, someone who brought consistency, presence, and a level of emotional steadiness that didn't operate on fear. And when those two worlds meet, something powerful happens, but it's not always sustainable unless both people are ready to meet at the same level of awareness. That's the part that often gets misunderstood, because it's easy to look at the outcome and reduce it to timing or compatibility or circumstance. But at its core, this was about capacity. The capacity to receive love without retreating from it. The capacity to stay present when things become real. The capacity to let go of control in exchange for connection. And those capacities aren't built in a moment. They're developed over time, through awareness, through discomfort, through a willingness to face what's been avoided. You brought something real into their life. Not perfect, not without challenges, but real in a way that doesn't disappear under pressure. And whether they could fully meet that or not, it left an impact. Because experiences like that don't just pass through someone, they stay. They reshape perception. They create new standards. They challenge old beliefs. But here's where the focus needs to shift. Not onto whether they realized it, not onto whether they regret it, not onto whether they'll come back with a new understanding. The focus shifts back to you. Because your ability to stay, to understand, to remain grounded in the face of uncertainty, that's not something to overlook. But it's also not something to give endlessly in a space where it isn't being matched. Love, at its highest level, is not just about what you can give. It's about what can be received, sustained, and reciprocated. And when that balance isn't there, staying longer doesn't create alignment, it delays clarity. So the real takeaway isn't just that they can't believe you love them through all of this. It's that you reached a point where you understood something even more important. Love that has to be carried alone eventually teaches you to put it down. And the moment you do, everything becomes clear.